Well, hello and welcome to Insight with Political Tours, the travel company led by reporters. The mood is darkening in Ukraine. This summer's offensive has come and gone with little sign of a military breakthrough. Abroad, the world is distracted by the Middle East, and worse still, Republican voices in the States are doing their best to cut off much-needed funding. So where is all this heading? With us, we have Orysia Lutsevych, head of Chatham House's Ukraine Forum, and she's here to discuss where Ukraine is heading and the West's support for it. Hello and welcome, Orysia.
Hello, Nicholas. Good to be back with you.
Yeah, no, great to have you with us. We last spoke to you earlier this year, and the first time we met was when that fateful weekend just before the lockdown happened in March 2020. Things were slightly different back then. Anyway, well, welcome again. You've just come back from Ukraine recently. Just tell us what the mood was like. Where were you? I think you go back and forth quite frequently.
Yes, I go to Ukraine, not as frequent as I wish, because it's an ordeal, to be honest, now to travel. It takes 24 hours. People forget that the sky is closed, right? I mean, this is something I'm being asked, why don't you fly? There are no flights to Ukraine, so crossing the border from Poland is difficult. But I've been twice recently in September and now in November in Kyiv and in Lviv, which is quite far in the west. And, what I would say is that Ukrainian home front is holding quite solidly. There's quite strong determination to continue the fight and the settling of, understanding that this will be a long fight, because there was quite a lot of messaging coming from Zelensky and his chief of military intelligence that, Ukraine will be in Crimea this year. There was kind of an upbeat mood after that successful counteroffensive last year when Ukraine reclaimed Kharkiv and Kherson. This year, people understand that this will take longer, but they are not despairing. They are saying, actually, we are prepared to take an additional cost in order to achieve sustainable peace, because alternative of quick settlement and either in exchange of territory means that this war will be postponed and again put on the shoulders of the next generation.
Okay, well, let's come to that thought in a second, because we're already getting into sort of the analysis of possible settlements. But the key point is that the mood has shifted in terms of the expectations of some kind of breakthrough, which many people were hoping for in the summer, hasn't happened. So there's almost a resignation, but an understanding that this is a long war. Can we turn then to some of the statements from the Ukrainian leadership? And particularly, I want to talk about the interview, and I think many people will have heard about this, with Zaluzhny, the head of the armed forces, and his interview with The Economist. What did he say, and why did that cause such a rift with Zelensky?
Well, I think, to be honest, the rift is a bit exaggerated. It's about the messaging that they were trying to calibrate. I mean, again, what was clear is that in that article, Zaluzhny was outlining the obstacles to that breakthrough and why these high expectations did not actually succeed, why he, in a way, as the commander-in-chief, could not deliver what perhaps was expected of him. And he points to 5 predicaments, obstacles. One is the lack of sky control. Ukraine does not have aviation compatible to Russia. Although he says we are destroying quite a lot of airplanes and helicopters, and Russians are afraid to move into Ukrainian territory. They usually launch attacks from Russian territory. He talks about lack of electronic warfare. And this is something about the future of war, where the adversary can see you, you can see the adversary. The battlefield is totally transparent. It's very difficult to do infantry maneuvers in that condition. And he says we need technological advancements, a breakthrough, new technology, if we want to defeat Russians on the battlefield. He still emphasizes that this is very much an artillery war. Even in winter, we will see a lot of artillery exchange, and being able to destroy Russian artillery is a first step towards a land offensive. In addition to sky control. So he says Ukraine needs much more rounds for artillery and artillery units itself. The fourth one is horrific mining that Russians did in Ukraine. They basically had time to dig in, and they dug in into, unseen anywhere in Europe, probably in the whole history of wars, scale where you would have five mine ordinances per square kilometer. So it's basically impassable. And what they do is they have this technology. When you demine, they can immediately sow in mines again. So it's like uphill struggle, like a Sisyphus stone, basically, the moment you reach, and then they completely undermine the work. And the fifth one is actually Ukraine's own human resources. He says for Ukraine to both repel Russian aggression, because let's remember, Russians are also attacking in the Donbas region. Ukraine needs to mobilize more human resources, train them better, change legislation, create a register of military personnel, manage it better, manage its human resources better. It means better training, better taking care of the veterans, better medical, military, medical support. All of this must take place. And he was talking about the war becoming a position warfare rather than maneuver warfare that we want to see.
Okay, let's just take a look at the map here. I think everyone can see this now, just as a reminder of the little progress. And I think if we go back a year ago, that there was that incredible breakthrough further north, in which the Ukrainian forces took tens of kilometers or 40, 50 kilometers of territory in a matter of days. And so there was that kind of expectation. So set against that, these the advances that they've made, which you can see there in yellow, are really just a few kilometers each, and that's over months. So the comparison that people have made is like the First World War. It's so set in, you've got people in trenches, and it's so heavily fortified. The attacker loses very many forces, and so Zaluzhny, the commander of the armed forces, is he commander of the army or the overall armed forces?
He is all commander-in-chief of all
commander-in-chief of the armed forces. Yeah. So he said, he's quoted in that article as saying, there will most likely be no deep and beautiful breakthrough. But the point you're making is that this was a call for we need to reorganize, and we need to be better equipped. But how was that interpreted by the president's office?
Well, I think, everybody is exhausted, let's be honest. People are on their nerves. And of course, Zelensky understands that Ukraine needs a unity of the message. And I think he almost misinterpreted a bit Zaluzhny's article. He was not talking about it being, he used this word patovaya situacija, where, in chess, there's no move that you can make in order to advance. Zaluzhny was actually saying the opposite. So Zelensky's chief goal is to sustain hope inside Ukraine, sustain high morale inside Ukraine. And his response to Zaluzhny was saying, yes, there's nothing new that the general said that we didn't know. We need F-16s. We need to better organize our training. We need more munitions. And this all happens as Europe confirmed that it will not be able to deliver 1 million of 155 artillery rounds that it promised Ukraine because of its own, regulatory problems and often lack of finance. So Zelensky was trying to say, we know that there is a pathway to victory. And this is where they agree. Zelensky says, we don't give up on our pathway to victory. And this is very much supported by society, like I said at the beginning.
So in response to the article, also Zelensky fired the head of the special forces, and I suppose that was seen as
I wouldn't make that connection. I think it's a bit pulling it too much. I think there is some politics going on, which is quite dangerous, between popularity of some of the senior military figures in Ukrainian society and fear of, competition, so to speak.
Fear in the presidential office?
Yeah, who is the biggest hero, so to say, of this war? I think there are some, these could be evidence of some disagreement on perhaps the tactics of the war, but I don't think that is in response to Zaluzhny's article.
Okay, we'll come back to the politics in just a second, but in the short term, what's been the response among Western allies? What is the flow of arms like? Are those promises being fulfilled in terms of delivering new technology? I know there's F-15s or F-16s are being delivered in the new year.
Well, F-16s, the program of training has started, including in the United States, which is quite significant. And we do know that the format that coordinates military assistance, this Ramstein meeting, is going to take place soon. Again, they are quite regular, and I'm sure there will be discussion about all these capabilities in preparation for next season, and what Ukraine immediately needs for winter. I think that we have a trouble that the first phase of this war, we scraped everything there was in storages, so that it's was easy, if you want. Now, this is more difficult because we need to replenish the stock, which takes time, as it is visible with these 155 shells. And our economies here in the West, in the UK, in Germany, it takes time. So this is a critical gap, the possible moment of a critical gap when Ukraine needs these things. It's just not in stock. So while Russia at the same time is really putting its economy on the war footing, it's now manages to go around sanctions to procure what it needs for missiles, and we do know that they produce about 100 missiles now a year, and these are going straight to shoot at Ukrainian civilian cities and infrastructure. So this is where we are in, I would say, dangerous moment, because every day counts on the battlefield, and we haven't done enough preparation to give Ukrainians what they need immediately.
Okay, I'd love to get questions from people. Do start putting your questions in the Q&A box. It's very important that you get to put your own questions too, Orysia. Orysia, you've been talking about this week in, week out. This is your job. Are you more worried than you have been for some time?
Yeah, I'm worried about next year for different reasons. One, of course, it's the change of mood and narrative. And even in your introductory message to this event, you're speaking about failure. So this is I think, a dangerous, it could be a dangerous pathway, because then people justify their inaction by some temporary difficulty. I think it's something where people who are worried about their own security may want to believe that you can somehow freeze this conflict, to which I don't think it's possible. And we've published an extensive report called How to Win Russia's War, and it's multi-authored position. You can take a look at it on Chatham House website, where we actually ring alarm bells all the way from the summer, that if we continue current level of support, we'll be in trouble. Ukraine, we need to double down. So I'm worried that this message is very slowly sinking in. I'm worried about elections in the United States, and how dysfunctional Washington may become. Even if there are people wishing to help Ukraine and understanding what's at stake, it's just not going to be delivered. There will be elections in the European Union this year as well, and that means senior leadership will change, and that will take, again, time. But I am also optimistic in the way that, or hopeful, I would say, that Ukraine starts negotiations with the European Union. That is a significant pathway to Ukrainian victory, how people see themselves being part of the European Union, being a full-fledged member. I also see Ukrainian economy holding up pretty well, and Ukrainian own defense industry is warming up significantly, with a budget increase of almost 40% going to drone production, Ukrainian air defense, Ukraine is quite strong also in artillery units. So that is, I think, a very mature decision, because you cannot be so reliant on Western assistance. And also, I think the United States has appointed recently Penny Pritzker, a special envoy for economic recovery. That means they understand that this is, you need to win war also economically, not just militarily, to make sure Ukraine has the resources to compete in this war of attrition.
So that's an important point to pick up on. That point is that we've talked about military support, and you say there's a danger of that flagging. We could get into the details of the kind of weapon systems that are being supplied and the slowness on that, but we won't get into that now. But you're saying that the economic support is as critical. It's trying to keep the economy afloat, and this is a long-term struggle.
Absolutely. You know, there's this saying that military wins battles, but it's the economy that wins wars, because the economy allows you to mobilize resources. It allows you to consolidate what you have and punch back, basically. So for that, there's an interesting development alongside negotiations for EU membership. EU has put forward a Ukraine facility of 50 billion for 4 years that will start in January of next year. That will include budget support, a lot, roughly 30 billion of that 50, but also de-risking for investors if they want to go and, you know, build business, I don't know, a drone production. They will get insurance. Roughly 8 billion of that will go into private sector support. And then you have technical assistance kind of capacity so Ukraine can deliver on these projects. And also, as I mentioned, US is now becoming more and more prominent with this appointment. And there is this multi-donor coordination platform that is meeting regularly with secretariats in Brussels and in Kyiv. This is where we need to reorganize, to kind of recalibrate from this first phase of war to make sure it's more sustainable in the future, that Ukraine grows its own GDP even during the war, has more revenues, is less dependent on foreign budget support, which this year will still be roughly 40 billion. Think about it. It's just to finance Ukrainian budget so that they can pay salaries, pensions, they can pay Ukrainian soldiers to fight. So this is not sustainable. And this is what we will try to see this year, reshifting this into a more sustainable mode.
Okay, so that sounds like some positive developments, some sort of clear thinking about on the kind of support that's needed there economically. I want to talk about the war in the Middle East. How is that affecting the debate globally in terms of support for Ukraine? I mean, I'm particularly struck by comparisons. If you think of Russia cutting off fuel to Ukraine or water, or shelling civilian areas, being accused of targeting hospitals, many in the Middle East, and I think around the rest of the world, will accuse the West of hypocrisy for not accusing Israel of doing the same thing.
Yes, absolutely. This is what is happening. I don't think Biden administration really handled it very well in terms of distinguishing between, you know, the right to defend itself by Israel and the kind of way it is defending itself. And, you know, we do know even like the US diplomats are resigning in disagreement of Biden's policy.
But what's your worry there about the impact on Ukraine? Yeah. How does that knock back on Ukraine?
Look, I mean, to be honest, these countries that are accusing United States of hypocrisy were accusing United States of hypocrisy even before. So it perhaps amplifies that sentiment, but it's not changing it dramatically. If there are strong anti-American sentiments in some places of the world, this just reinforces them. But we were not making much progress even before the Hamas-Israel war in convincing the rest of the world that, you know, that this is a world order question. So, of course, the biggest risk is what is happening in Washington with Ukraine's military and security assistance, and how it immediately was presented as a binary issue, Israel or Ukraine, by some people who probably don't want to support Ukraine, which I think is risky. And if it continues to be this binary issue, either we support Israel or we support Ukraine, it will be very bad news for Ukraine. Biden, of course, is trying to get after the 23rd of November, the package that will include Israel and Ukraine to be voted. But this is the biggest impact. The rest, yes, of course, it's difficult, but I don't think it's critical.
Just to sort of follow up on that, there was an interesting survey that came out from the European Council on Foreign Relations, and there was also an article picking up on it by Ivan Kostev, from whose works along the ECF with ECFR and also runs a think tank in Bulgaria. He says that this is that the opinions in that survey show that the global South really don't care much for Ukraine and see this as a proxy struggle between the West and Russia. How do you interpret that? What do you draw from that survey?
Yeah, Nicholas, please note that this was before the Hamas attack on Israel. So this was before. So this is why I'm saying that we are not winning any kind of hearts and minds of people in the global, in the middle powers, as they call them in the report. And I don't think we will. This is why, for us in Chatham House, we haven't invested much of an effort to convince them otherwise. We had a couple of conversations. This is pretty much a transatlantic issue. This is a US-Europe issue with Russia. There will be issue with China in the South China Sea. There's an issue now in the Middle East. And this is, kind of the global villains are Russia, China, and Iran. They all have regional spheres of influence that they want to dominate. And countries will cluster around these spheres of influence one way or the other, supporting or opposing it. I don't think we'll get the whole world together. But what is striking in the survey you mentioned, and I really encourage the audience to go and read it, is that Russia is viewed to be the winner in many countries. So who is likely to win when they are asking? In China, it's 74% believe Russia is going to win. In Saudi Arabia, 70% believe that Russia is going to win against Ukraine. In India, 63%. And also those countries believe that Europe is going to collapse, EU is going to collapse, that this is not a bloc, this is not a regional unit that is able to compete in this geopolitical environment of strong men and superpowers. So they have a very kind of pessimistic view about European or Western civilization.
And that would coincide with Russia's projection on the conflict, which is that this is, I guess it's no longer about winning for Russia anymore. It's about showing that the West is weak, that Ukraine is a failed state, and that really you just got to come to a deal with this because there's no alternative.
Yeah, I mean, for Russia, Putin made his own rule centered around West as the enemy. This is why it's an existential conflict also. There's no way for him he can rewind it as the leader of Russia. The only way we can come to terms with Russia in the future is if somebody else is at the helm and this somebody announces and declares this policy basically being erroneous, it was a mistake. Until that happens, Russia will be very, aggressive interestingly, Russians themselves believe that they are succeeding in Ukraine, despite, as we've seen, they are not taking also any territory. They are losing tons of men, they are losing tons of equipment, but they believe that they are winning because this war prevented attack on Russia by the West. So this is their prism of thinking. Putin managed to convince Russian population that they are under attack. That is why we are in this kind of coming back to this possibility of negotiated settlement. I do not believe in it because the only settlement there would be on Putin's terms, and that basically would mean, Ukraine ceding its territory that Russia annexed in its constitution, and no leader of Ukraine will do it because there's no wish for that in the Ukrainian
Well, let's talk about that, because there's a leader of the opposition, or an opposition figure, who says he wants to run in elections. At the moment, it doesn't seem very likely that Ukraine will have presidential elections next year. I think parliamentary elections have just been postponed now. Yeah. Can you tell us about that opposition candidate and what's his suggestion?
Well, who are you talking about? Petro Poroshenko or the
No, not Poroshenko. I'm afraid to say I can't remember his name at the moment, but I'm trying to remember his name, but he suggested that essentially we should have some kind of peace deal, a treaty with Russia.
And maybe you're talking about Arestovich. I don't know if there
maybe.
there's this kind of, I mean, he is the manipulator of the highest order. I would be very cautious to take what he says as a serious political proposition. But yes, what I'm trying to say is that why Ukraine has this kind of position on negotiated settlement? Because of Minsk. Since 2015, when the first protocols were signed, Ukraine was negotiating with Russia. There was trilateral group, there were meetings. There was even meeting between Putin and Zelensky in 2019 in Paris. They were trying to negotiate the way out of this war. And where are we today? In a bigger war. If that didn't happen, if those 8 years did not happen, the proposition of negotiations would be much more, I don't know, appealing, or people would at least have some trust in this. But because negotiating with Putin means accepting his terms, and he uses actually negotiations to achieve his war aims. Russia never was meaning to implement any of the Minsk agreements. It basically bought in time to rearm and to attack Ukraine in a much more vicious way. So that is why I think, first, Putin is not interested in negotiations. Ukrainians understand that this is existential conflict. It's a bit like Napoleonic Wars. It's a bit like, fight against the Nazis.
So you're saying the focus is wrong. In a way, you're saying that this whole focus on what Ukraine should be doing is not the right focus.
No, the focus is that the kind of Russia we're dealing with is not an entity that you can negotiate with. If you look at ideology, if you look at Putin's hold on power, he needs war. He doesn't need peace. That is why the task is to defeat his troops on Ukrainian territory, undermine his rule in this way, because no dictator can sustain defeat, and then ensure that there is justice. Otherwise, we will be in perpetual war with Russia. It will not be just a question of Ukraine anymore. Believe me. And this is something that people in the West think you can still insulate yourself from this. I don't think so. Putin will do everything to undermine European Union through the Balkans, through through money. We see that. So it's now or never, in a way, I think, because if we don't get it right now, we'll just put this war for our children to fight.
And with the US elections in January, in a year from now, so in November 2024, and possibly either Biden or even Trump being there in the White House. I mean, how much time? If you wanted to, it would seem to me that the EU has said it's going to provide the financial support, and that's a good thing. But can the military support be supplied by Europe alone?
Not to the extent that we need to defeat Russians. That is clear, because United States alone this year combined what Europeans provided. So it's, 50-50, right? I mean, 50% of Ukrainian military capabilities are provided by United States. And that is not sufficient, as we see now, to dislodge Russians from Ukraine. If that falls off, it's easy math. It's not going to be better. But we have to think about the cost of Ukraine's failure. And this is something, again, there was an interesting calculation done by the GlobSec, which is the Bratislava-based think tank, that looked at how much it will cost for 4 countries of Eastern Europe, Poland, and Slovakia, Czech, and Hungary, if Ukraine fails. For Poland currently provides roughly 4 billion of military assistance to Ukraine a year. If Ukraine fails, it will cost 25 billion to Poland to defend its border. This is the kind of thing we should be thinking about. So clearly, Europe has it much more in the skin. Especially Eastern Europe, they understand also what Russian occupation means. I mean, UK and France was never occupied by the Russians. If you look at the horrific statements of what is happening on those occupied territories, and you can look at Reckoning project, for example, that is taking testimonies of people who lived through Russian torture chambers, who Ukrainian children are now in deportation camps in Crimea. What we will find there, will be shocked. These are not just my words. There's evidence for it. So this is what I mean, is that even my bet, is that even if Trump wins, I think he may even double down on supporting Ukraine, because I do not see any American president making deals with autocrats like neo-fascist state like Russia is. What kind of deal he can make with Putin? No deal. I don't think so. And remember, Trump was the first to give javelins to Ukraine. Obama was a disaster. We have this war because of Obama. He was a disaster. And then,
in what way? So
in what way? He said that defense of Ukraine is not American national interest. This is what he believed. He believed Russia will always have escalatory dominance in Ukraine, and there was nothing we could do to prevent it, which we know is wrong. He provided no military assistance to Ukraine jointly with Merkel, who insisted it was the right policy. These politicians led to one of the largest wars in Europe.
Okay, fair enough. There's a mixed picture in Europe. I guess you've got positive signs from the elections in Poland, but what happened in Slovakia?
Slovakia is not a good news. And Slovakia, and this is actually a warning sign for all of us, that populations that are unhappy economically are getting these kinds of right-wing movements back into power because they are dislodged. This is the effect of COVID. And on top of COVID, you have an effect of Russian disinformation that was not restricted in Slovakia. And you have Russian money going into elections for these kinds of politicians through all kinds of deals. And I think it's interesting to me as these countries, as I say, lived through the Soviet occupation, but they almost want to deny that past happened. And this will cause a problem. Of course, it's a rather small country and its weight in supporting Ukraine was very small, but they may cause trouble with, sanction extensions and approving funding for Ukraine within the European Union. This is Putin's calculation that this will increase, not decrease, and more countries will turn anti-European in their political establishment in the capitals. And this is why they believe European Union may collapse as a project.
In terms of elections and the sort of time ticking, the clock ticking, are people emphasizing the need to deliver weapon systems in a particular time or artillery within a particular time? I don't know if you can also talk about Serbia. Serbia's supplying artillery to Ukraine at the same time pursuing a very pro-Russian policy and very nationalist policy within the Balkans.
Well, first correction, Serbia is selling. Let's remember, this is very profitable. Ukraine is trying to scrape and buy everything that there is. So for Vucic, it's a good deal. And then actually Slovakia also said that they will sell, maybe not provide. This is a difference, right? Fair enough. I think that perhaps this war also exposed all these links within, as I said, in the Balkans and in Germany. I mean, look what's happening there. We're just scratching the surface with this journalist who was paid 600,000 to write good books about Putin. He was an established figure in Germany. This is just the news of this week, and it's Guardian's investigation. So I think people are much more cautious now to take a very clear pro-Russian line. And if Serbia in the end is in the middle of Europe as well, and I don't think it's very expedient to align yourself with a leader that is wanted by the ICC, International Criminal Court. That is something that also happened this year, that Putin is wanted in The Hague. There is an arrest warrant for him issued by the International Criminal Court. So I think he's becoming increasingly toxic, at least in Europe, not perhaps everywhere in the world, but everywhere in the world also he now has a limited capacity to travel because of that. So I think war in Ukraine exposed a lot of this, and politicians are trying to maneuver.
Despite some electoral, some governments that are pro-Putin, you're saying generally there's a significant awareness of a threat from Russia. But coming back to the first part of my question, which is about the clock ticking and weapons supplies. I mean, you have a lot of contact with people like the Royal United Services Institute in London that monitor the military side of this conflict, and you're in contact with people who monitor this across Europe as well. Is there a clock ticking? Are they concerned about in terms of weapons deliveries and arms supplies?
Well, the clock is ticking in the sense that if Ukraine doesn't mount offensive, Russians do. This is something people forget, that Putin did not change his military objectives to actually conquer more and more of Ukraine. He wants to take all of Donbass, and this is where we see Avdiivka going on. He feels threatened in Crimea. So on one hand, Ukraine has to have all the right kit to defend from Russian assaults, which are now they are pushing more and more human and everything to take Donbass. And something that we perhaps didn't discuss, but as a success of this summer campaign, is how Ukraine succeeded in threatening Russian dominance in Crimea. The fact that Russians had to move their fleet to Novorossiysk, the fact that it again destroyed 2 or 3 significant Russian ships, the fact that there are increasing drone attacks on Crimea, Russians feeling, the danger there. They are already fortifying the Perekop Strait that connects mainland Ukraine to Crimea. In a similar way, they were building these Surovikin lines. Why are they doing it? So I think we are seeing to a degree what Ben Wallace wrote in his article, the preparation for the Battle of Crimea, that Ukraine is preparing now, and it will continue, because the only way we could see some settlement or some negotiations when Russians will feel they are losing Crimea. They will lose Crimea militarily. They are not idiots. They will understand capabilities. When this moment will come, they may decide that it's better to negotiate some transition period about Crimea rather than lose it miserably on the battlefield. That's
a really interesting point. I'm going to share the screen again, because I think you've said something that we haven't sort of covered before, and which is the first point being is that the Russian Navy has really been, although it's still firing missiles, has been confined to its ports because it's so exposed, and so that it doesn't have the ability to defend or actually go on the offensive as it thought you'd think a global navy would be able to. It's really essentially confined to ports, and even in port they're losing ships. So what you're saying is militarily the pink strip across the top, Luhansk, Donetsk, Zaporizhia, Kherson, those areas are militarily much harder to take, but Crimea, the peninsula, essentially an island, is much more exposed.
Yes, absolutely. It's exposed because what I'm not a military expert, but they know how to read the sequencing of attacks. And that sequencing of attacks that Ukraine has mounted on Crimea included taking down Russian air defense systems that are both here to protect the Bay of Sevastopol, but also to direct missile attacks on Ukrainian territory. S-400, one of those that is Russian pride, and it's even the name called Triumph. It has been destroyed by Ukrainian drone attack. And of course, something else that is happening in the Black Sea, it's this grain humanitarian corridor. After Russians pulled from the grain deal, right, officially they say we are not extending the grain deal, it still functions. And I think more than 400 cargo ships have been transporting not just grain, which is also good for Ukraine, because Ukraine also needs to export steel and other things. Otherwise, its economy is struggling. So that actually shows that if you push Russians out, there's little they can do if they don't have capabilities to threaten you. So this is what we're after. We can defeat Russia, including in Crimea. Like you say, it's easier than the landlocked parts of Donbass that have all the railway supplies to Russia. And it's a strategic asset, not just for Ukraine. This is a strategic asset for global food security, for Black Sea security, for environment. There is, this part of Ukraine in the south had a lot of renewable energy that was destroyed by Russia, wind, solar. If we want to do climate transition, we need these resources to be put into good of humanity, not Russian military base. So watch Crimea, what will happen. I don't think Russians will get respite there.
Okay, I know that there's a new. You mentioned the insurance deal for people who want to invest in Ukraine. I know that there's an insurance deal for ships carrying grain, and that's enabled. I think is it some 400 shipments to take place since that new insurance deal came into place. So that's an example of how things are turning around there. Orysia, I mean, I'm not getting questions from people. So if people want to put questions down, they're going to have to do it fairly quickly. Otherwise, we're going to wrap up in about 5 minutes' time. So please do, if you've got any questions, and you must surely, this is one of the major issue of our time in Europe at least, please do put your question down in the Q&A box, and we can put it to Orysia. And then we've got Tim Ripley. So Tim Ripley is there. I've got more questions, but Tim, go ahead with yours.
Hello, good to hear you. Interesting talk. The sort of blowback from the Middle East war and the impact on the Ukraine crisis is perhaps being felt most acutely in the sort of drop-off of media coverage of the Ukraine war in the West and the United States. You've got most of the Western news organizations have pulled their people out of Ukraine, dropped their spending on Ukraine coverage. They've all gone to Israel. They're all doing reports from,
the rooftop in Jerusalem.
Yeah, it's all that stuff. Yesterday, The Guardian stopped doing its daily blog from Ukraine. So, I mean, that's obviously the first major problem in generating support for Ukraine in the West. The second thing is the oil price is nudging up, and if this war in the Middle East goes, regional, the oil price is going to go through the roof, and we're going to have a repeat of last winter's economic shock in the West, which, so you lose media coverage, and then the economic pain forces, rounds of austerity in Western Europe and North America. That could be the sort of the hammer blow for future support for Ukraine.
Yeah.
Are those statements or questions?
Well, I mean, they seem to be observations, but I'm interested in the perspective from Ukraine on whether that's how it's viewed from Kiev.
Yeah, you mean I had my list on like Twitter, where you create people you follow on the war, and then you come, and now they're all talking about Israel, right? How they are doing the land operation in Gaza. Obviously, there are war reporters who report on wars, and now this is the new big war going on. I'm worried, but I wouldn't be worried so much, because I still think that as long as we have, we must build a long-term strategic, pathways for Ukraine. This is what I mean. This was, for many, it was a shock. We did not come prepared to this Russian invasion, which is the question to ask ourselves maybe later why. But similar to like EU is now proposing this 4-year plan. We need to think about like that. Politically, what are the facilities? What are the vehicles to support Ukraine towards victory? not just deny Russia the right to win, but also enable Ukraine to restore its territorial integrity and viability of the state. So this is what I'm more interested. Are we having these policies in place that are mid to long term? That means these security memorandums that are now being negotiated with all the G7 countries as part of the, there was this decision in Vilnius NATO summit that Ukraine will get security guarantees. So now Ukraine is discussing with Washington, with London, and we need to ensure that this support, like for Israel before, is annual, that it includes access to modern weapons, like Zaluzhny described. So we don't have to ask ourselves this question anytime. We have to take a strategic decision that Russians should not roll over Ukraine, that Ukraine should succeed as an independent state. It should become a member of NATO and EU eventually. And what we must do now, all these sustainable things. Otherwise, it will be a headache for everybody. The war may spill over as well in Europe. Look at what's happening in the Black Sea. Look what was happening between Finland and Russia also on the pipeline. So this is a serious issue, and we're not going to solve it with like putting patches, like Band-Aids, because we have it in a drawer.
So it's got to be a long-term institutional commitment, a long-term institutional commitment. So
as long as we have this in place, but oil price is a very important point, because of course that will fill in Russian coffers. But what is interesting that I don't know how effective these measures will be now to basically tackle the shadow oil fleet that Russia was using to avoid the sanctions, and that FT article that showed that no Russian oil was sold under the price cap is quite a shocking, right, discovery. So now Denmark will be taking more action to control the ships that are passing the straits, to make sure that they are not part of this shadow fleet. And it's important that we show we are serious about it. There's little we can do about global oil price, but there's a lot we could do to, kind of restrict Russian access to global oil markets.
So great observations there, and good questions. Thank you very much, Tim. Tim, can I just come back to you? Can you fill us in on what has been delivered to Ukraine and what you expect coming up? You work with Jane's Defence and you're a military analyst, so you've got an overview of this. So Tim, can you tell us what's happening?
Well, I mean, we've talked about this in a couple of times. I mean, the big issue really has to be the lack of industrial capacity in the West to generate the type of weapons and the quantities that your panelist has talked about. Obviously, earlier this year we had the big debate about supplying the tanks and the armored vehicles and for the ground offensive. I mean, we ended up, I think, the West divvied up about 150, 200 modern main battle tanks and about 600 infantry fighting vehicles, and they were delivered and they've been used in the offensive, and probably about half to 2/3 of them have been either knocked out or severely damaged. And the issue really has to be, has the West got the industrial capacity to deliver any more in that quantity? And at the moment, the resources are not being put into doing that, and that's the sort of, it's a question of production of shells, tanks, armored vehicles, all that stuff. And I know your panelist talks about a long-term commitment. I mean, that is, at the level that, so far the West has not been able to do.
And the Russians are quite strong at electronic warfare and jamming, aren't they?
Yeah, all that stuff. But I mean, it is a war of attrition, and in World War II, we had the arsenal of democracy, where the United States delivered the means to fight the war. Certainly in the Europe, Western Europe, the UK, there are no major orders for tanks. There are no major orders for artillery systems. There are no major orders for armored fighting vehicles. So they're dependent on the stockpile, which is being used up and being chewed up and spat out. So the war of attrition, certainly from the Western point of view, Western Europe is not being fought.
Orysia?
Yeah, this is such a good summary, Tim. Thanks for helping me out. But I want to remind the listeners also about where's the land lease that Americans approved. It was such a a fancy signing ceremony by President Biden. And of course, that instrument hasn't been triggered yet because we were, of course, land lease includes financial pipeline. If we indeed are depleting the stockpile, there's no alternative but to give orders to the defense industry. And that also is good for, our own economies. Perhaps that's not the type of economy we wanted to have, but it's if Russia remains, as UK review says, the most acute and immediate threat to the United Kingdom, who is now diminishing Russian threat but not Ukrainian armed forces? So logically, it all makes sense. It's just that operational and execution of this strategy suffers for all kinds of reasons. And I think people have to take it seriously. Otherwise, the price will be just higher the longer we procrastinate.
And the price being?
Well, the price being the collapse of our European order as we know it. The price being that these powers, revisionist powers, who claim not only Ukraine, but also all the way imperial possessions to Narva, will be expanding. And, Putin has a personal revenge project. He thinks if Soviet Union collapses, it's his mission to destroy European Union. This is where we already are. Russia is in that revanchist period of its history. That is why it's so dangerous. And I hope people understand that it's not just about Ukraine.
Yeah. Ultimately it's about Europe, democracy, rights, some really fundamental principles. Listen, I think, Orysia, we're going to wrap it up there. It's been a really, really good discussion. My thanks again also to Tim Ripley for joining us and providing us some military analysis. Tim, as I said earlier, writes for Jane's Defence, and he produced a book back in 2015, 2016, Tim, called Little Green Men, which was about Russian tactics at that time. So he's been keeping an eye out for some time. But Orysia, thank you very much indeed. Thank you very much for your overview. It's been wonderful to see you and get your insight again. Thank you very much indeed.
Thank you so much, Nicholas. Have a good day, everybody.